many of those which feel inspired and called to work in some way as a practitioner are in some way our own, are wounded healers, have our own issues and our own struggles. And hopefully, if we've been diligent and we've been effective in the self-development work that we've done, we've come a long way with those things. But the more we focus on clients, the more we have the responsibility and the emotional load that comes from that. Our own development becomes all the more important. So welcome to the first Flourishing Friday. And in Flourishing Fridays, I'm particularly focusing towards those of you watching the vlog or listening to the podcast, working as practitioners. Or indeed, those of you perhaps that have some kind of desire or intention at some point towards working as a practitioner. This could be anyone from those working in the psychology field as a NLP practitioner or psychotherapist or counselor, or nutritionist or medical practitioner, or anything else kind of where you're working with people in some kind of one-on-one capacity. And in this episode, I wanted to talk about perhaps one of the things that I think is most important for practitioners is self-development is a superpower. Sounds a bit overstated, but really what I'm talking about is the importance of continuing to work on ourselves when we take the role of working with others. And I have a fairly helpful lens, let's say, with which to understand this issue, because at Optimum Health Clinic, we have 20 full-time practitioners working with us here. I also run the Therapeutic Coaching Practitioner Training Program, where we're training new practitioners and supervising former graduates in their ongoing practice. So I've seen a lot of things over the years. I guess I've also had a few of my own experiences as a practitioner over the years. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is many of those which feel inspired and called to work in some way as a practitioner are in some way our own, are wounded healers, have our own issues and our own struggles. And hopefully, if we've been diligent and we've been effective in the self-development work that we've done, we've come a long way with those things. But the more we focus on clients, the more we have the responsibility and the emotional load that comes from that. Our own development becomes all the more important. And I will, in Flourishing Fridays, I'm going to do some videos around self-care and how practitioners can best take care of themselves when they have a heavy client load. But it's just remembering as a kind of starting point why self-development, self-care is so important. I think one of the other things that can happen, and this was something that was a bit of a shock to me kind of after I discovered that it happened, was relatively early in my career as a practitioner. I was doing a lot of client hours. I was doing a lot of teaching, and I wasn't in, at this point, a ongoing intimate relationship, and I wasn't particularly investing time in family and friendships. So I was spending a lot of my time in the role of being practitioner or being teacher. And what I realized after this kind of chapter of my life is that we can become identified with being the wise one, being the kind of supportive one. And it's almost like in the moments of doing that, we kind of get used to being the role that we play there. And then we just start to become identified with that role in the rest of our lives. And so when you're working as a practitioner, obviously bringing your own issues into a consultation isn't appropriate. But we can almost start to forget that we have our own issues when we get used to being the one that is wise and the one that is listened to and the one that has the kind of the insight into what is happening. We can forget just how important it is to remember that we still have our own work to do. Our own self-development is an evolving and developing thing. I say this as someone that has invested well over £50,000 in the last 20 years in my own self-development. And I mean that separate to my own recovery journey, my health journey when I had chronic fatigue. Now, you could argue, am I just able to do that because I've been successful as a practitioner? I would argue that I've been successful as a practitioner, at least in part because of that investment. Does that mean that everyone watching this that's not a practitioner needs to spend tens of thousands of pounds on self-development? Absolutely not. Inevitably, when you're working deeply in a field, you're going to have a deeper interest and I guess a deeper focus in that. But something that I see is that people come as a wounded healer. They're significantly focused on their own self-development early on. They then qualify, they become a practitioner, and then somehow they get used to the comfort of that role and their own self-development kind of stops. And I think apart from the fact they're just being sad for someone's evolution, that it kind of doesn't reach its full potential, I think to really walk the talk with the people that we're working with, we have to be walking the path. We have to be continually doing our own developmental work. And whatever we do, not necessarily all times, but it's certainly at certain points, that should involve doing some kind of one-on-one therapy work. It isn't just going to workshops and courses, which is great, but we don't have the same spotlight on us. We don't have the same accountability when we're one of 15 or 20 or 100 or 200 or 1,000 people in a room than we do when we're working one-on-one with somebody. And if your story is that, I can't, I'm now a practitioner, I know it all, I can't find someone to work with, then I would say that's probably a bit of bullshit that's going on there. If anything, the breakthrough at one stage becomes the limitation at the next stage. And what I mean by that is the things that helped us get to a certain point aren't necessarily the things that help us go the next point. And if, for example, you've gone very deep into a particular area of working, let's say that you've trained as a counselor and you've done a lot of your own counselling kind of work as a client, and you're kind of like, well, I've done everything, I've done all that, then the evolution is not going to be necessarily doing more counselling. It'd probably be to go and work with a coach, or to go and do some psychotherapeutic body work, or to go and do some kind of perhaps some couples work if you're in a relationship, or perhaps you've got trauma that hasn't been worked with, and to go and do some kind of trauma work, be it tapping or EMDR. But continuing, one of the things that's really been a service to me has been when I feel like I've got a bit comfortable in my own self-development, to challenge myself into new areas and new disciplines. And that's part of how my experience as a practitioner over the last 17 or so years has continued to evolve as I've gone off and experienced different things, brought those into my way of working and tried to evolve and develop, not just personally, but also in my capacity to see things, to hold things, to explain things, and to support people in their own path of development. And I think it's really important, the more we get used to being in the role of being practitioner, to have those times where we feel vulnerable, where we're not just surrounded by clients and students and people that think we're great and wonderful and so insightful and all the projections that go with that. But we have our own tribe and our own places we go where we get called on our bullshit. We get forced to see things that we don't want to see, not necessarily not in a cruel way, but in a clear way. Some of the things that we do at Optimum Health Clinic, for example, is all the practitioners, for example, in the psychology team, we have different focuses in each department. But to give an example for the psychology team, they all have a internal supervisor, which is normally the director of psychology. They all have an external supervisor, someone they can talk to outside of the organization about their client load, people they're working with. Many of them, all of them at different points, many of them in their own, working with their own therapist, their own therapeutic journey. They all have a certain amount of budget each year to go off and do different courses and workshops, which very much are often outside of the stuff that we're doing. So they're bringing new ideas and new perspectives into the organization. So wherever you are as a practitioner in your development, if you're early in your career, if you're kind of maturing in your practice, or perhaps you've been doing this for decades, self-development is a superpower. It will support you. It will allow you to keep on developing. It'll keep on reigniting your passion in the work that you do. And it's just part of the service that you do for your clients, that you are walking the talk of what you're teaching. So I hope that's been useful. This is the first week of the vlogs, the podcast. I'm very keen to have feedback of what has been helpful, isn't helpful, what you guys would like more of, less of. Tomorrow we have the first Spotlight Saturday, and I'm going to focus on the podcast for the vlog for the first Spotlight Saturday. So I'm going to tell a little bit about the story of why I started doing this daily project. Some of my hopes, some of my intentions, some of the reasons why it's structured in this way. What we'll do down the line is it will be more a place for some of my favorite books, research studies, courses. Just there's so much stuff kind of linked, I guess, to this point. Self-development is a superpower. I've been such a passionate student for so many years of these areas. I'd love to put a spotlight on some of the things that I found helpful and I love. So I look forward to talking with you again tomorrow.